Welcome to today's episode. We're being joined today by Joe Aamidor out in Boulder, Colorado, who is coming onto the episode to talk to us about smart building management. Joe's an expert and a guru in this area. Really excited for the conversation that we're about to take on. Joe, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So, Joe, smart building management, really fascinating topic. I think it's going to be of a lot of interest to our audience. Could you start maybe with an introduction of yourself first and what you and Aamidor Consulting do? And then maybe we can get into like, what is this? What is smart building management and how do we start to define that?
That's great. I'd be happy to. So about me and about my background and the work I do, I'll be brief. I have a pretty full website that explains project work and expertise, but I focus on smart buildings, which I'll come to in a moment and talk through that. And I focus on product management, product strategy. So within a lot of technology companies, there's a role called product management. That's what I used to do at Johnson Controls, and then at a small startup that's now part of Acuity Brands, which is a big lighting controls company. And the product side of the house is typically focused on what are the key customer pain points, what are the problems to solve, and can we solve them in a business in a way that makes money for the business and will grow a business. So you're kind of focused on the middle between. There's a technology side, we build technologies, solutions, and there's a business side. How do we go to market? What are we building? What are the problems in the industry? And what I do now is that in a nutshell, but with a variety as an independent provider to a variety of both companies. So that can be a vendor that has a solution, and they might need some specific help on, for example, the competitive landscape, the market sizing opportunity, or the market size, and what is that opportunity? The voice, doing voice of customer, capturing feedback from individual customers or prospects. Sometimes also pricing, packaging, positioning of a product. I also do similar work with investors who are looking at making investments. I don't know that we'll get to it, but there's a lot of money flowing into both prop tech, which is property technology, and smart buildings, and then also clean tech, which also kind of touches smart buildings in some way. So between those trends and those funding dynamics, there's a lot of people looking to put money to work, and they may call me to dig into a particular company they're looking at either acquiring or investing in. And they do a little bit of work with owners and operators of real estate. So those who are actually managing their building, to your point. I write a fair bit. I have a newsletter every month that really covers this industry and this market, specifically smart buildings. And that probably brings us to your second question, or the second part of the question, what is smart building management? So I tend to think, if you look at a building, commercial buildings typically, so anything that is where people work, where people learn, where people go for medical care, where you buy, where you eat, those are commercial buildings. Industrial would be another category, whereas residential buildings are anywhere you live. So I mostly focus on commercial of all kinds. And within that, you think of the life cycle, right? You design a building, you construct a building, you're in a building, you're operating the building, and then maybe there's an end of life decision. Do we want to retrofit it? Do we want to tear it down, build something new? Probably better to retrofit, of course. But that middle, the operational phase, that's building management, right? We're managing the building. And there's a whole lot of dynamics, but I tend to think of smart buildings as really more focused on both the back of the house. So things you don't see as an occupant, but you would see if you're the energy manager, you would see if you're the facility manager, you probably see to some degree if you own that asset, that building. And then there's the front of house, the experience that you have as a visitor, as a worker, as an occupant, as a tenant. And so building management is everything that goes into that, from paying your energy bills, maintaining the equipment. Just like at a home, you probably call an HVAC service provider every once in a while to come and just do some work. Same with your roof, same with maybe landscaping. Those are all the same things that a building is doing. And they've done those things for really as long as those buildings have been there. Smart building management is, from my point of view, taking a more data-driven approach. So that can be using data. So there's an IoT component, deploying sensors, collecting data that maybe prior to this time was not collected, right? So it's just, we have somebody sitting and observing, and we can write some things down on a notepad. How many people are here? Now we actually have sensors that can just tell us, and they're more accurate, more robust, and they can be there as long as you want. So the data-driven aspect. Another way to think of this is moving from a schedule-based maintenance approach to a condition-based maintenance approach. So think of an air filter at your house. You might change your air filter every 3 months, every 6 months, something in there. We have a smart thermostat. It actually tells us when you need to change your air filter, and it's based on runtime hours. So it doesn't have to do with how long has it been. It has to do with how much time has your HVAC system actually been running, which can be different based on different climates, times of year. So that's an example. In a large building, there's much more complexity, right? The HVAC systems, maybe we'll get into this, but the HVAC systems are not just you have, a kind of a unitary product or a split system in your house. You actually have a lot more than that. But the same trend or the same scenario is in case. Maybe you just use data to tell you how many runtime hours have there been, how many people are there, what is the temperature. And that's one example. There's many examples of this, but that's what I tend to think of as smart building management. The last thing I'll note, there isn't necessarily an actual definition to say this is smart, this is not. It's not black or white. There's definitely a gray area there. And there are different examples. You can have smart building management around your lighting system, but maybe not around your HVAC system. So I wouldn't say you would look at a building and say, this building is smart, this building across the street is not smart. Though another thing we can get into, there are some standards, there are some rating and kind of qualification and quantification regimes out there to help give some sense of how smart might the building be. And I expect that to continue, and maybe for us to have more robustness around that in the future.
Excellent. Okay, so lots to unpack there, because I could take any one of those threads and go for about an hour just chatting with you on that. We're going to try to touch as many of those as we possibly can today. So looking forward to that. But if I could try to, in Schuster words, try to pull together what you just said in a concise fashion, it sounds like using technology to improve the data decision making via data for building management. That's really what encompasses the smart building sector, if you will.
Yes, I think that's right. There's the collect more data so we can make better decisions. There's also, and I didn't touch on this, but there's also the angle of analyzing those data. What's interesting about larger buildings, not so much small buildings, homes, but large buildings, you've always had a lot of data in those buildings, at least for the past couple decades, but it's typically been on premise. It's typically been in systems that maybe are a little more on the proprietary side, maybe harder to analyze. So a lot of that data isn't really used or utilized. But another key point is using those data streams, maybe unlocking them, maybe bringing them into the cloud, being able to run different types of algorithms on those data sets. That also has a big impact, because it might tell you things such as, we think this piece of equipment in the building might break, or can be very simple. There's a higher likelihood these pieces of equipment break, lower likelihood those pieces of equipment break. That can be based on the energy signature. That can sometimes be based on vibration, based on a whole host of other factors. And that is also smart building. It's instead of being reactive, it's being very proactive, right? I'm going to call the tenant in that space and let them know, we think tomorrow there might be a chance that there's a comfort issue in your space, maybe just because you have a lot of glass. That's common for new buildings. You're on the top floor. It's a bright sunny day, and it's supposed to be very, very hot. If you're looking, there's a whole host of things that you could do with that information, but it also could be, let's go fix something if we think it might break soon.
Yeah. So we are well beyond just a Nest thermostat thrown into an office and claiming that to be a smart building. It seems like it really encompasses a lot of all aspects of the building. And I think that's where I was going to go next. I was going to put aside a little bit about the history of where this has come from, which I really do want to touch on. But I'd love to know, when we start digging into the value that commercial buildings, whether it's a property manager, a building owner, or even a tenant, an office or a retail shop or a college, university institution, whatever it might be, do you have a good rubric for thinking about the types of value streams that smart buildings are meant to unlock or improve upon?
Yeah. I do generally, I would say that one, the value stream may be different based on type of building, or asset class might be another term you hear sometimes used. So office versus industrial. I would also note that that's still, there's levels of maturity, maybe both in terms of the capabilities from the vendors and the demands and expectations of the buyers and or users. So the rubric is not necessarily, there's not something I can point to say, here is the rubric, because I think it can be different for different types of technologies, different types of categories of technology, if you will, different types of buildings. But what I would say is the core value streams, one is definitely energy savings. I think related to that is carbon reduction, but energy savings is the one that's probably most mature because you get an energy bill, regardless of what type of building, you get an energy bill. It's metered. There's pretty good visibility into how much am I spending. You can compare that to weather data and kind of analyze, am I spending more than I should be, less than I should be? And it's also just you're spending money, right? So if you're trying to figure out ROI, what's the benefit here? Reducing that spend is a good thing. So that's absolutely one. And I think many vendors in one way or another can help you save energy. And they oftentimes talk about that in case studies, for example. So that's one. I think the sustainability angle is related, right? If you reduce energy in a building, you're probably reducing the carbon emissions in that building or of that building. And that has an impact on reporting. A lot of organizations and kind of different levels of adoption, again, by different asset class, but there's a lot of reporting to say these are our carbon emissions. This is the trend over time. This is our goal. And now you're starting to see a lot of institutional owners of real estate. That could be office, that could be warehouse. They're saying we have a plan by 2030, 2035, 2040 or beyond to get to net zero. And a lot of that is based on data today and then tracking out where do we want to go. So that, I would say, is a little bit less dollars and cents of if I reduce my carbon emissions, there's actually more money in my bank account. But you would argue that tenants typically are attracted to buildings that have more robust sustainability policies. There's a linkage there. I think it's not solely that tenants are out there only saying, I want the building that has the lowest carbon emissions, but there is some linkage. Those buildings typically are better managed, more well managed. There's also investors saying, we're investing in this fund, which is investing in this real estate. We want to have these data at hand. This is part of our qualifier, our kind of checklist now. So you're seeing that, but it's related. If you can reduce energy, you're going to see a reduction in emissions in most cases. I guess I wouldn't guarantee that, but it's pretty safe. So that's one angle. I think where we've seen a lot of growth over the past few years is on the tenant expectations, the tenant experience. Tenant experience is a term that's being used a lot. It can mean a few different things. Sometimes it's a little squishy, but I'm still using it just because tenants have expectations around how the building performs. That can be simple things like, if I'm operating a hybrid work environment, I want the ability to find a desk quickly because I don't have an assigned desk. And there's technology that can help you do that. I want the ability to book it early, right? I can log in the morning before I come to work. I can book that space, and I know for the morning or for the whole day, there's a desk there for me. There's a technology component there, but that has a big impact. And also the other side of it, you typically can get higher utilization out of your space if you allow people to work in a more flexible or hybrid fashion, in that you don't have an assigned desk, but we're pretty confident whenever you need to work out of this office, there will be a desk there for you. So there's that angle, and that's definitely valuable because the money you're spending on the real estate, one, you have to buy it or lease it. So that's usually on a per square foot basis. If you are the owner, you have to maintain that space. And that's basic things like custodial service, and then more robust things like the renovations that might happen every number of years, and everything in between, maintaining, fixing things, air filter changes, as I discussed earlier. So if you can, one, just get into more utilization out of less space, those costs will probably come down. But also you may be able to spend, or as the owner of that real estate space, you may be able to get more money on a per square foot basis by having better utilization of that space. That was at the core. If you remember, we were trying to go public the first time. There was some real value in the idea that they had around, can we put more people in a space that is smaller, or give you a better experience in less space? The economics of the whole floor or the whole building do change if you can do that. And so that's a piece of it. There's definitely other value streams. I think if you're able to predict equipment breakage, you may just have less cost to maintain that equipment. You may fix something before it, think about a car. If you never get oil changes, if you don't take it in for regular maintenance, at some point you might have a really big problem that's much more costly. Buildings are similar in that anything if you can predict and identify failures, problems before they become big. Leaks is another good one in that bucket. A leak can be really destructive, a pipe bursting or just other types of leaks, because that destroys a lot of the physical building. And also, if you're a tenant, you probably can't go back to that office for a while, and you may get some type of relief on your rent. So that has a cost impact. If you could predict out where is there a potential leak or identify it very, very quickly, that also, again, using smart data or data from a smart system, smart sensor, I think that you could go on and say there's a lot other value streams, value props, but those are some good examples, I think, for the purpose of this discussion. Yeah.
I think those are wonderful, and part of the reason why I've been so excited about this particular interview is that I'm learning things as we chat as well. Certainly as we think about building management from an energy perspective, from a sustainability perspective, you've layered on there the maintenance and some of the other concerns. We could go even further into, as you said, tenant expectations, all the way through to security, all the way through to a whole bunch of different ways that smart technology and data-driven decisions can really, and a digitalization of these options can really improve the building management, right? I think that gives us a really good overview and a perspective in terms of what smart building management is. I'm going to go backwards in time, and to your point earlier, to sit there and say parts of this have been put in place for decades leading up to this point, right? There are many very, very large buildings who have complex building management systems in place that do a whole bunch of data tracking in some form or fashion. The utility can go and actually install, advanced metering systems and smart energy collection devices, if you will, to understand what the dynamic and envelope of that building really is. It sounds like it's changed a lot to today. For those who have some basic understanding as to what it looked like a few years ago versus where it is today, give us some perspective as to how it's changed and what is it today, and how are you seeing some of these trends improving or changing as we start to go forward?
Yeah, and would you like me to start with a quick one on what was it a few years ago, and then maybe what is it now, and then
Let's do that, if for no other reason, just to educate me, because I've got some experience in terms of some old, complex building management systems, right? And this isn't even all that long ago, but thinking about it from an energy perspective, going into a large industrial facility, for instance, you have to collect a lot of that data just to understand where your load is and how it's changing over time, what's actually taking that perspective, et cetera.
Yeah, no, makes perfect sense. So, you have, if you look, even a few decades ago, you had, I think within a building, and we're talking about building management, the core product that was in most large buildings is a building automation system, BAS, or sometimes called a building management system, BMS. And I tend to use those interchangeably. I suppose I've seen some reports where they say they're slightly different, but the building automation system, those have been around since late 80s, early 90s. And that was related to this idea of direct digital control. So a digital interface to actually control temperatures, heating and cooling, from the thermostat to what's in the ductwork and everything in between. And that's a network. Just like you have a network for internet connectivity in most buildings, you had a network for building automation systems. Before that, interestingly, without going there, you usually had pneumatics if you had anything, and that was air pressure. So you had tanks of pressurized air that were actually, as a thermostat was changing, that was letting air move into ductwork and
we've come a long way since that.
We've come a long way. There's still a lot of buildings though with pneumatics. If you ever hear somebody say, "Oh, that building still has pneumatics," that's pretty old technology. That's the move beyond that is to get to direct digital controls. But that's the building automation system. There are 4 big companies that make them. There's a whole host of other companies that make building automation systems. Those still exist. They've obviously become more modern, but they're still really core parts or fundamental parts of a building. So if you're in a large building, university, hospital, office, you can look on the wall in every space or room and you'll see thermostats, and sometimes they don't have anything you can change. Historically you might see lock boxes where they want to know the temperature. You can unlock the lockbox, change the temperature. You've kind of moved away from that. But those are the kind of the endpoints that are sensing what is the temperature. And then obviously in the ceiling, you have the equipment that is putting hot or cold air, also ventilating to deliver that temperature. So building automation systems have been around for decades. They continue to be around. I don't think by any means they will go away, because if you're building a new building or you're upgrading a building, one of the core needs, not the core need, but one of the core needs is being able to deliver comfort to the people who are in the building. And a building automation system is kind of a proven way to do that. They're typically historically on premise. there were proprietary protocols in terms of the actual communication protocol. Now you have a variety of open protocols. One is BACnet, BAC, NET, and the BAC are capitalized, but if you just type in BAC, NET, you'll get some information. That's kind of the preeminent standard. There are others, of course. Other countries or other regions have different standards. But all of that is an ecosystem, probably tens of billions of dollars worldwide spent within building automation. I've seen different estimates, but tens of billions of dollars is definitely in the ballpark worldwide. And then you could say the US might be 20, 25, 30% of that, because more developed economies typically have bigger buildings, more developed buildings, and they need more building automation. So that's been there. That continues to be there. I think you could look at other types of system. Lighting control is a good example. Access control and security, fire and life safety. Those are all historically siloed systems that have hardware, have some type of network usually, and have some maybe interface, but it might be on-premise in that building to view and monitor and see what's going on. And they deliver kind of a core need in that building. What we're seeing now, if we want to move ahead, how have things changed? One, more of that's going to the cloud, though not a lot of those core systems have in terms of overall market, have not moved to the cloud. I think more and more we'll see that. I think more and more the companies that make the building automation systems will have either a hybrid approach where there's a cloud capability, there's an on-premise capability. You think of like the edge in the cloud. Some of them may have everything in the cloud. That's an interesting story to look at over the next 5 to 10 years. But you're also seeing modernization of those individual systems. You're also seeing convergence or integration between them. Integration, on a building, you can integrate these systems. And you can think a simple reason you may want to integrate access control with HVAC, because maybe you don't exactly know when people come in and leave the building. It changes a lot. Well, if you tie your building automation system to your access control system, you then have better data. Are people coming in or are they not? Because they're badging in, badging out. So there are reasons. Also, maybe you want to set a schedule and you wanted to change both how the lights work and how the HVAC system works. And if those are two separate systems, there are ways on a per building basis, more of a kind of a custom integration engagement, you can integrate them. So that's happened for a while. You're going to see that happen more. But now what you're seeing is more solutions that are easier to plug those things together. The other big change you're seeing are more, I would say, either supervisory or cloud-based portfolio-focused data solutions. And that can be energy management, that can be facility management, equipment analytics. We're going to, across your entire portfolio, give you data in terms of where are there problems, what are those problems, and then you, from more of a portfolio based, you can dispatch somebody to go fix that, or you can see what type of labor do I need, what type of service provider do I need to fix that, because maybe now I know what the problem is. Even simple examples we used to use back when I was a product manager was, if you know what the problem is, you might be able to take the right part with you. In some cases, if you don't know exactly what the problem is, a lot of these the HVAC equipment, the lighting controls equipment, all these the access control equipment, there's a lot of SKUs. When I say a lot, hundreds of thousands per vendor, maybe even a couple million. They're not putting one of everything on every truck. So when you see a Siemens truck or a Johnson Controls truck, Trane or Carrier, Schneider, a Honeywell truck driving around, they probably don't have one of everything on that truck. So having just the knowledge of, we know what the problem is, that has some value, even in kind of a maybe a simple way that you might overlook. So where things are going are more integration, more cloud-based systems that I would say supplement what is happening in the building. Maybe those vendors might say, well, we can replace all that. And in some cases, that could be true. In some cases, that might not be true. And then you look at, I mentioned earlier, different types of commercial buildings. In smaller buildings, think of just a big box retailer or a restaurant. They may not have a building automation system, mostly because it's just more than they need. It's more costly. They're not going to spend all that money. But maybe they want more than just a thermostat that somebody in the building can change whenever they're hot or cold. That's notably interesting in restaurants, because if you're working in the kitchen, you're probably really hot just because you're in the kitchen. But you don't want to make it so cold that people come in to eat and they say, I'm freezing. I'm not coming back here for a while because I didn't enjoy the experience. So being able to have a smart thermostat, to your question earlier about a Nest or something like a Nest, that does give some control and supervision to maybe the enterprise or a region within that enterprise, that portfolio. And that also can be used in some cases to figure out things like fault detection. Is there a problem? A really easy one, if you have set the temperature to 72, because that's just kind of a typical temperature, and that space never gets below 75 in the summer, that's an indication of something potentially being wrong with the cooling system. And if you know that, maybe the people in the building don't quite know, because one, if you're in the kitchen, you're hot anyway. If you're a guest, you might not tell them, oh, this is all great, but it's really, really hot in here. Maybe somebody happens to mention that, but you can just use data to identify that. So we are seeing some convergence where places that didn't otherwise have these older on-premise systems are now just jumping ahead or leapfrogging ahead to a smart system. I think other quick points, where is the market? You're seeing pretty good adoption. I've written some articles even 3-4 years ago trying to estimate adoption. It's a really hard thing to actually quantify. But the question of just how many buildings have smart technology. Now, taking the point I had earlier, there's not a thing that makes it smart versus not smart. But there is some data out there around just maybe cloud-based energy management. And then you're seeing more maturation in the ecosystem. Events now focused on these topics, newsletters, resources, not just my newsletter, but many newsletters focus on different angles here. A lot of investors focused only on, at least on prop tech, which is property technology, but maybe even specifically on smart buildings. So all of that is good for the ecosystem. And you're also just seeing, related to that, more and more money being spent, more companies raising money, more companies growing. So that's where the market is. The last quick point, I don't want to talk your ear off, but I think utilities have their own kind of infrastructure, right? You have a smart meter. Now, most places in America have smart meters, not all. And that is related. You can put meters in a building that are separate from the smart meter that probably will be pretty close. Historically, that was, again, kind of another silo, right? We have a utility bill, we get data from the utility, but it's usually our bill a month late. That's starting to converge a little bit as well. By no means do I see the utility saying, oh, you don't need a utility-owned smart meter anymore. You can just tell us what you think you owe. So I think there's always going to be some inherent separation between some of these legacy systems and platforms and ecosystems even, but there's certainly more convergence.
I think that you've hit on some really interesting trends that are occurring out there, especially around the convergence, and even to the point where, if I can put words into your mouth, kind of the democratization of the building controls, if you will, to the point where it's not simply controlled through a building automation system or a building management system, but really kind of pushed towards the tenant, and they can actually start to work with this in ways that they wouldn't necessarily have had access to in the past, right? To layer onto some of the different comments that you made, right? This is a big market. This is still an emerging market in the fact that there's a lot of growth and opportunity as we start to realize what buildings can do and how to manage these better. Some of the data that I've come across estimates that this is going to be $121 billion globally by 2026, just the smart building aspect of this.
Right.
And Realcomm actually estimates that there are 3,000 plus vendors providing some sort of technology, device, software, or data into the space today. And that has the potential of growing very significantly, obviously, over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. So to your previous point, the ecosystem is robust, it's growing, and it's really helping property managers and building owners figure out how they're going to be managing and optimizing these huge investment assets.
Right. I think that's all true. Those numbers sound absolutely right. I think when I say tens of billions, I've seen some estimates of growth getting to 100, 120, 130 billion. The one thing I will note, if those listening to this think, wow, this is a huge market. It is, but there's still currently a very big market. There was a McKinsey blog post, I think, and I can send you the link and we can put it in the show notes, I suppose, that was looking at legacy or conventional building automation and then the growth over, and I think this was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and then looking ahead 8 to 10 years. And what they showed was that there's still, for the legacy systems, which they kind of allude to on-premise deployed, there's no growth there. It's like a $50 billion market worldwide. But then there's a new category, maybe not new, but a very growing, or very significantly growing category called connected building management that would go from a few billion to like 20, 25 billion. So overall, big growth in that part of the market. When I see these estimates, I think it's just worth noting that typically includes the hardware, the software, the services. And a lot of companies, especially startups, really focus on one, not all of those. And usually they focus on software. So as you kind of peel back the onion, if you will, the specific market you're in may not be that big. So I'm not at all trying to dissuade people. We need more people working on these issues, but it is a large and growing market. But there's also a large legacy market versus, if you looked at the internet in 1985 and the internet in 2000, the growth would all be from zero or from almost nothing to a lot. So just a quick clarifier, but yeah.
No, that's perfect. And I'm giggling here because we started with building automation systems, moving into building management systems, moving into smart building management. Now you've added in connected building management from McKinsey. It feels like we're in that cycle here.
The terms I would say, you could argue maybe could be used interchangeably. I mean, building automation systems, that's really something. There's an industry there. Connected building systems, smart building systems, intelligent building systems. I've really heard all of them used. So
perfect. All right. So let's put a pin in that. Okay. I think we've got a really good understanding as to what and I'll use smart building management or smart systems as my go-to definition for today. I think we have a good understanding as to what the definition is there. I think we've got a good understanding as to some of the different value levers that customers can pull upon and why this is such a growing market. I think we've got a good idea as to what the size of the market is. Okay, let's dig down, because at the heart, 8 Minutes is an energy podcast to talk about how these technologies can help buildings decarbonize, can help them get to an electrification standard or meet a building performance standard that is required. And I was hoping I might be able to dig out of you, where and how is this technology helping the energy transition, helping these buildings, walk through the energy transition?
Yeah. So one, and I hear these numbers pretty commonly now. I think this is becoming a bigger theme in just mainstream media, which is great. About 40% of all carbon emissions are from the built environment. I believe that includes the construction. Cement, again, making cement is a huge source of emissions. So it's not just the management. It's, we build a building, we manage it, but 40% is big. And that, I believe, is residential and commercial.
And that goes much, much higher in some of the big urban environments, to the point where the New York City Accelerator estimates that up to 70% of all emissions in New York City come from their built environment. So
right.
When you talk about some of these really dense urban environments of New York, Boston, Chicago, that can be a very high number.
Yeah, and I would think part of the reason it's higher there is you probably have less personal transportation and more mass transit, and the emissions from mass transit on a per person basis is typically for ICE.
You also have really big buildings.
Yeah, and they also have really big buildings, but the buildings themselves become a bigger share if other parts. So I agree with you. So one, if you're just looking at how do we deliver a strategy around energy transition, how do we deliver a strategy for the world around reduction of carbon emissions, you can't really ignore buildings. And then within that, commercial buildings and homes are typically, the two big categories. You can obviously get lower and lower and lower, and you can start looking at things like data centers. And there's been a lot of work around making data centers more efficient, which again is a big growth driver because we have a lot more data centers. So buildings are kind of central to that. I would also argue there's a lot of waste, or not argue, I should say, is kind of a fact. There's a lot of waste in buildings. So that can be anything from simple things. The schedule isn't quite attuned or in tune with when people are there. Maybe that's we heat and cool the building all day, all night. We don't really need to do that. If you're in Texas or Florida in the middle of the summer, you don't just turn off the air conditioning system overnight, but you maybe don't need it to be 72 24 hours a day. Maybe it can drift up to 75, 77. That will save energy. That is a net positive, but people can still be comfortable. Same example, if you just see lights on all the time. Now, a lot of lights have moved to LEDs. LEDs are just significantly less energy intensive than old fluorescents or other types, CFLs or so you're getting some improvement, but still you can do even more by not leaving them on overnight. So it's related to the energy transition in that from an operational point of view, from an energy efficiency point of view, when I hear energy efficiency, which there are different ways to get there. One, more renewables, more storage so that we can use those renewables at all times. But there's also just let's use less energy. Let's cut out the waste. And that really is buildings. you know, you don't leave your car just running all the time because you say, "Oh, I'm not really sure if I want to go somewhere or not," or I might get a call from somebody who wants to, you just leave it on. Whereas that's kind of how some buildings, to some degree, have been operating. You can save a lot, and oh, by the way, that saves a lot of money too. So when you think of the energy transition, that's a piece of it. I think the other big piece of it that you're starting to see a lot happen, both the federal government between demonstrating technologies, trialing them, writing nice reports, publicizing all the results, but also just private sector, is this idea of grid flexibility. And I don't know that we'll have a whole, that could be its own podcast actually. But as you have more renewables on the grid, as you have a need for more flexibility. I'm sure that's something you've talked about, but basically there's storage, right? We can charge up a battery in the middle of the day when the sun is, top of the sky, very bright, a lot of energy. There's also pricing signals. If you look, a lot of places, California is a good example. The peak period, if you're a large building, you're paying a different amount of energy at different times of the day. It's all publicized. It's all available. So going in, what do my rates look like? But everything has been shifting back to kind of afternoon, late afternoon, and evening. Whereas before, like middle of the day, 11 or 12 noon, that's when energy was the most expensive. So it's all shifting back, mostly because you have a lot of solar in the middle of the day. So you don't actually have as much of a supply constraint. There's a variety of things you can do to aid the flexibility of the grid. One, just think of buildings as the end nodes, right? So you hear this a lot around EV charging, which is relevant. Maybe if you plug your car in when you get home from work at 5 p.m., maybe it just automatically won't start charging until 9, 10, 11, 12 p.m. or 12 a.m. Because you just need enough to get to work and back the next day, maybe a little bit of a buffer. So that's one example. But buildings, same thing. You can pre-cool the building. So that means start cooling earlier in the day. And I know that maybe sounds counterintuitive for what we've talked about. But if the energy is a lot less expensive, then it's also maybe less carbon intensive. You're starting to see data sources out there now that can actually help you understand the grid intensity throughout the day and where you're at, what region of the grid. There's, again, without getting into a lot of detail, there's different grid operators and regions of the grid. And some of them, there's an east and a west. They're completely separate. And then there's Texas. And the fuel mix is even more specific than those three regions I described. But, Washington State, there's a lot of hydroelectricity. You go to the Southeast, a lot of coal. So carbon intensity is different. But the flexibility has a lot of impact. And maybe it's cheaper, less grid intensive or less carbon intensive to pre-cool that building. So get it lower than you want, let's say 70 degrees, not 72. But then when, you get to like 2 p.m., 3 p.m., 4 p.m., which maybe that's when the grid is under strain, and the options for the utility are send signals to people, please turn things down, please turn off your lights, please don't run your washing machine until the end of the day. The other option is, well, you've already cooled the building, so you can coast into that period. Actually, a lot of smart thermostats for a house, they have these types of programs. I think where I'm at in Colorado, they might call it grid rewards, or grid flex. The names always are something like that. But the idea is we'll get your house a little bit cooler than normal, but then from 3 to 4 or 4 to 5, we're going to turn off your system. Large buildings can do that as well, as an example. And they can do it with a lot of things. You sometimes see escalators get shut off in malls. Maybe you don't see that, but that does happen, where they say, we don't, no one's here after lunch before the end of the day. Let's just turn off the escalators. Again, that's kind of a grid flexibility aspect. So the building control systems, just to wrap it up and put a pin in it, the building control systems are controlling all the equipment. They're actually turning things on and off in your building. Typically, those use energy. If you need flexibility, if you need to curtail energy at a very quick point in time or very specific point in time, they're pretty good ways to do that. Now, there are challenges. It's not like hit a button and we're all ready to go. The whole grid is smart now. But that's the big one where I see the connection, among others, with buildings are a big consumer of energy. Buildings are a big contributor to carbon emissions. Buildings are typically wasting a fair bit of energy on an aggregate level. There are certainly very well managed buildings that don't waste any energy. And then you have this ability to be flexible in when you use and how you use energy.
Yeah. So let me see if I can simplify what you just said, because the way I think about energy optimization as it relates to buildings is really twofold. All right. One of which is to reduce that waste, to your point. And a lot of smart devices have really fascinating ways that they can do that. You mentioned before, tying it to your access system to the point where you can actually start to kick the HVAC system on as individuals are starting to actually enter into the building rather than setting even a set time. It can be much more dynamic, or setting it with your lighting control. And as somebody enters into the office, that's when the lights come on, and the lights actually will go off as they exit, so that you don't run the risk of leaving lights on or any issue like that, right? So what we're doing is we're reducing waste, reducing the load and the amount of energy that you're consuming just on that basis, right? And then the second part of it is really around this demand flexibility that you so elegantly described for us, which is to sit there and say, given certain price signals in the market, all right, which is the traditional demand response type of reaction, given price signals, can I adjust my energy load, based off of that, so that I can save money or not spend as much, if you will. And more recently, as we shift towards more of a carbon signal or an emissions signal from the market, can I adjust how I'm using energy to be less carbon intensive over time, right?
Right.
And then along that flexibility side, there are incentives that can pay you to reduce your carbon load. There are incentives from the utility to help them with their grid flexibility. In some markets, I probably should be very careful about how I describe that, because not all,
and they're
markets
different
are the
benefits
same.
usually. I mean, it's like the state regulators, but generally agreed with everything.
But really, what smart building technology allows you to unlock is this ability to reduce your waste and the ability to optimize around your usage to the point where you can optimize around what's important to you, whether that's price, whether that's carbon, whether that's some other factor.
Operational equipment, right? You have very old equipment, but you just really, really don't want to replace things. Maybe the idea of things turning on and off more than normal, that's your no thanks moment, right? I don't want to be, I don't want to actuate a lot of my equipment more than I have to, if you will. Yeah.
Right. All right. So, but as we think about these building technologies and the applications that they have, are there certain locations, geographic areas, different places that may either have a high concentration of commercial density or incentives or utility backbone and infrastructure, where these types of technologies and this momentum that you talked about has more application or more value? And how do you think about that? And how do you advise your clients as they're starting to think about the types of markets that they should be attacking?
Yeah. There's the kind of the framework, if you will, of how do we prioritize across the entire map? And you could say the map might be worldwide. I think for our discussion, let's think US. I've certainly gone through that analysis for specific types of buildings or types of vendors where everything's a little bit more localized to, well, this is what we do today. We're not planning to build a completely new product. So an opportunity outside of our strike zone, if you will, is not relevant. So sometimes the analysis that you talked through is done with a little bit more of a focus. But more broadly, I've also had discussions with people who have kind of looked at this when they're pitching you, or you just meet them at a conference. They say, this is why we're going after this market, not that market. But I think it's a combination of factors. One is, if you're looking at a type of building or a type of asset class where you have a lot of them, if it's offices, the major gateway markets have the highest concentrations of offices. So that's DC, Chicago, New York, Boston, some of the Texas metros, obviously San Francisco and Los Angeles. Seattle's probably up there. So you could look at that. But if you're looking at something like a small or mid-sized commercial building, your target might be who are the largest retailers, who are the largest restaurant chains. And those tend to be national brands. And there you might go another step and look at, well, what's the cost of energy? And usually you can figure out on a per state basis, what is the cost per square or the cost per kilowatt hour? It's high in California. It's the highest in Hawaii, actually, by far, because they're bringing in oil, I think, for most of it. And that's also why they're investing a lot in solar and wind and renewables. But if you look across the continental US, high in California, can be high in the Northeast, really low. I think lowest is in Washington State because there's just so much hydroelectricity. And that's just always running. And once you've built the power plants, there's not a lot of cost. It's kind of the same dynamics as other renewables, right? Once you have the solar panels, there's some maintenance, but it's not like you have to buy the coal to put into the power plant. So that's another one. I would tend to think if you're looking at commercial real estate, office buildings, looking at what are the prevailing rental rates per square foot. So typically New York and San Francisco oftentimes compete for the highest rents. That's probably different now, just given that we've gone through a pandemic and different levels of occupancy. But individual buildings are also, I've talked to people that say, well, our building in Miami is the crown jewel of Miami. And their rents are even higher than the average you see in New York. But that's another one. I think the regulatory landscape, which is in this case different by state, usually different states have different programs, different incentives, different regulations. New York is a good example because they have local law 87 or 97, where they're actually going to, 97, they're actually going to fine large buildings for carbon emissions over a certain amount. And that's not something I'm an expert in, but there's that kind of stick. But there's also carrots around incentives to deploy various types of technologies, various solutions. Just as, at our house, I have a smart thermostat. When we moved in a while back, we got, I think, a half price discount or $100 off our smart thermostat. So it's about half off. And part of it was if you sign up for this grid rewards or grid flexibility program, you get that credit. Same things are happening for large commercial buildings. It's just, they're not giving you just a smart thermostat, right? There's different programs. It might be somebody can come and do a retro commissioning review of your building, which is where they walk the floor. They're doing kind of an audit or pseudo energy audit. Might not be a full-blown energy audit. They're identifying things, they're fixing them. And then some of the labor that goes into doing those fixes is paid for by the utility. So there's a whole host, I would say, of dynamics. I'm sure there's others that I'm not even thinking through, but those are the big ones that I would say really any type of building in any location probably can build a business case around deploying smart building technology. Business case may be stronger in certain locations. You may be able to be more comprehensive in certain locations. There may be the carrot and the stick that you see in New York, whereas other places don't have a stick, but they might have carrots. Chicago, for example, has a very good utility-sponsored continuous or monitor-based commissioning program, MBCX. So they're collecting data, reviewing those data, and then actually somebody will go and fix things in your building, and the utility will fund a fair bit of that work. So the service provider goes to all these large buildings and says, hey, you don't have to pay nearly that much to do this, and you're going to save energy, you're going to see a benefit. And then obviously the utility is happy with that as well because they're seeing a reduction in energy demand. They don't have to build a new power plant. They get the carbon benefits that go along with that. So it's not as much a question of this is where I would target. I suppose if I was having a discussion with an investor of just where should we be putting capital work, you could maybe go a level deeper and say, well, here's an opportunity. The other side might be the vendor landscape. Are there a lot of vendors? Are there not a lot of vendors? Though if you're the owner of the real estate or the operator, you may like the fact that there are more vendors because the solutions have been tested out. You can get better visibility into what really works. How does it work? Where does it work? Does it fit my building? But if you're building a technology, you might look at it and say, well, I don't want to go where there's already 10 people doing something really close to what I'm doing. And one of the challenges, we didn't get into this, but the fragmentation in the market, the 3,000 building vendors, you could argue that maybe is too many, just because some of them do very similar things. So finding the white space, if you will, as a entrepreneur or an innovator, that could be a better approach.
Well, let me ask my last question then, kind of leaning into that last point that you just brought up, right? Because I'm going to ask this in a two-part question, Joe, and okay. I'm hoping you'll be able to address both of them. One is, thinking about it from the perspective of the building manager or the property owner, who wants to upgrade and think about smart buildings in some form or fashion. Like, where should they start? Like, where should they be taking action today to drive some of these value levers that we're talking about? And the corollary to that, the other side of the mirror then is, where should vendors and software technologists be investing their time and effort to address issues that aren't being addressed today? Or where is that white space that still needs some support in some form or fashion?
Yeah. So on the owner operator side, so I'm looking to use these technologies to my advantage. Mm-hmm. A few things I would start with. One, is probably an assessment of what's the current state. And that might sound really obvious, but especially if you're overseeing multiple buildings, but even if you're in one building, it's not uncommon for there to be systems in place or programs in place or a team in place doing something related to this. And maybe if you aren't aware of that, it can be useful for you to just better understand what is happening today. What's the depth of that? A good example could be there may be a sustainability team doing sustainability reporting. There may be an energy or facilities team that's really focused on operational, delivering the environment in a cost-effective way to the tenants. And the cost-effective way just means if the building is a commercial real estate building, leased out space, it's a business, right? So you want to keep your costs manageable. So there's two sides of that. Usually they're talking, but maybe you're on one of those teams and you don't have full visibility into what the other team is doing. The data sets that are being used, just down to just core data, are probably pretty similar. So that assessment can be very useful. And then having discussions with various individuals. Where are we today? What are we doing today? What's not working? Where are the gaps? I think a really good place to deploy technology is where there's actually a problem that actually needs to be solved versus finding a really cool technology and figuring out, you want a solution that fits into an existing problem, not a solution that's looking for a problem, if you will. So having those discussions, that will look different by different sites. And then I do some of this work with building owners and operators where it maybe comes where I would get involved is they have a problem, right? We know we have a problem. This is the problem, but we're not quite sure how to solve it. That's where I can help with identifying types of companies, specific companies, doing a bit of an assessment, qualitative and quantitative, and then even getting them in a position where they can go and actually run a procurement process, an RFI, an RFP. Maybe I've seen some do an RFI and then an RFP. That's a good place to start and continue on. But I also think having that feedback loop of, what is the value prop that we have been sold? You can obviously do some work to validate, is that really feasible? Does that make sense? Is that achievable? But then even a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, are we hitting what we thought we would hit? Is this more successful? Is it less successful? That can be the difference or can help you to expand beyond maybe a pilot. And the other piece is pilots can be a really effective way of trialing some of this technology and going through all of the motions, not just finding something that looks good, but actually deploying it, going through some of the challenges that might come up with deployment, things like that. So that's what I would say to, if you're an owner operator, where do you get started? What's a bit of a game plan, if you will? If you're an innovator, I think that we're definitely seeing more and more individuals say, I want to invest in my time in this industry, which is great. We need more people. I can tell you, being in this industry for almost 2 decades, I've definitely seen people really smart, really passionate say, I'm just going to go get a job at a different type of company in a different industry because there's so much churn here. There's just challenges. And I understand that. I'm not criticizing anyone, but I think, having more people, I would say a similar type of assessment could be your first step. And that could be, what's the technology landscape? What's the vendor landscape? Where are there gaps? But at the same time, I meet a lot of companies or people founding companies that have done something in this industry. Maybe they're a mid-level or senior member of a team, and they had a successful run at that company. And they said, one of the challenges we had at this company was this other thing that no one is addressing. I'm going to build a company around that. And that's a more organic way of just finding a problem to solve, but I think it's very effective. Or you have a company, you're building something, you have this idea of a new product, but then you have to really just focus on scaling the core product. Maybe you come back to that other idea as a separate company in the future. So I would say there's maybe less of an exact, precise playbook if you're an innovator, but there are certainly places where I could note there's just not as much happening there, or there's more opportunity there. Some places where you say, there's a lot happening there already, might be a little bit crowded. I would say for anyone listening, I'm always happy to connect with current entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, and just spitball a little bit about different ideas. That's fun for me too. So I think I'll leave it there to answer both sides of that question.
Well, I think what's fascinating about all that is there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of value. It's a $120 billion market that's going to emerge over the course of the next few years, with a lot of white space opportunity for both vendors as well as building management and building owners, right? So to your previous point, you cannot address decarbonization goals without addressing the built environment. A major part of that, beyond changing out light bulbs, beyond weatherization, beyond electrifying the heating or air conditioning systems, a big part of the path forward needs to be smart building management, smart building controls, and connected buildings, as you laid out for us earlier. So, Joe Aamidor, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. If anybody wants further information on Joe and his group, we've got that information in the show notes. Really looking forward to having this conversation again at some point as the market matures.
That's great, Paul. Thanks for having me. It was really fun.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot. Cheers.